Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Volmer, and I'm from the University of South Australia. And today I'll be talking about my research on a comparison of predictive spatial augmented reality cues for procedural tasks. So first off, I want to talk about what was my research motivation, what would it be about? So my research was based around trying to improve performance, procedural task performance time, and not only performance time, but we also want to try and reduce the mental effort required during this task. And the way we're going to do this is by providing a set of predictive spatial augmented reality, what's known as SAR, predictive cues, to project the instructions that guide the user throughout the task. So first, let's look at some comparisons to previous works. So we know in human-computer interaction that visual cues can be used to try and guide the user, so, say for example highlighting a screen for them to look at. And we also know in augmented reality, using an assembly task as a Duplo box building task, that by highlighting the next block to place can also help improve performance time there. Furthermore, we can also see that during a procedural task here, where the user has to push one of the buttons highlighted by the green annotations, there's been an extensive study on comparing different augmented reality technologies, and it was found that spatial augmented reality was the most successful one to use. So what my contribution to this field of research would be is extending on the previous study that we saw with the dome, highlighted by green annotations. I'll be extending on this, focusing on spatial augmented reality only. And instead of focusing on the technologies, I'll be focusing on how we present the information in spatial augmented reality. And the way we're going to be doing this is by providing the user with a set of predictive cues. And the way we came up with these predictive cues is by looking at previous research. And we evaluated them and categorized them into two different categories. One being target-based cue, where you would have the current task shown as we do here for the baseline condition. And then maybe an additional annotation that will either be blinking or a different color. And we also have directional-based cues, which will be an arrow, a line, or an arc located around the current task, pointing in the general direction of the next task location. We'll go over these in a couple of slides down the track. So with these cues in mind, we designed a set of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis was that we predicted that having a predictive cue would be better than having no predictive cue. The second hypothesis was that we predicted directional-based cues would have better performance than the target-based cues. The reason for this is because the target-based cues look very alike to the current task annotation. So some users might get confused to push the current task annotation button or the target-based annotation button instead. And the final hypothesis was we believe that task complexity will also have an impact on the predictive cue's performance. So for our experiment design, we designed two different experiments. One was a single case experiment where only one annotation would be shown alongside the predictive cue. This was a simple experiment. And then we also had an all case experiment where all 16 annotations would be shown at once, as we see here. And this was our complex experiment, as the user would have to try and search for what task number they're up to. And for both of these tasks, there would be 16 button presses per sequence. And this would be repeated in 5 blocks. So each condition would appear 5 times. And this is all randomized, so no condition would appear more than twice. And for a post-experiment survey, we used the pass scale to get self-evaluated mental effort. And regarding participants for our studies, we had 20 different participants for each study, with a majority being male and right-handed. So onto the conditions themselves. In addition to the baseline condition, what we have here is our single case condition, where we have, for target-based, we have blink, which would have an additional green annotation that would be blinking for the upcoming task. We have color, where the upcoming task will be highlighted by an orange color instead. And then for our directional-based cues, we see we have just one green annotation, but we also have directional-based cue in the form of either an arrow, which will point in the general direction of the next task, or we have a line, which will link from the current task to the exact location of the next task. And this follows suit for the more complex experiment as well. We just have 16 annotations now instead. So we see we have our baseline condition, we have our blink, where the upcoming task is on the blinking off state. We have color, where the upcoming task is a different color. Arrow, where the arrow is pointing to the upcoming task. Line, where the current task and the upcoming task are linked together. And we have a new condition known as arc, which was one of 8 different arcs which would point off the current annotation, and it would point in the general direction of the next task location. Now, the reason why we added arc in was because of results from the first experiment for the arrow condition weren't quite what we expected. So speaking of results, regarding response time, we can see Here, experiment 1, we can see the line condition had the fastest response time, with the target-based cues having a very similar response time. Meanwhile, the arrow predictive cue had a similar response time to the baseline condition. Whereas for the more complex experiment, we can see that the baseline condition is significantly worse than all the other conditions as task complexity has increased. And again, we can see that the line condition is the most fast, and all the other predictive cues are relatively similar in performance time. We also have the results here regarding the error rate. We can see that for the simple experiment, that line cue had produced the least amount of errors. And the next one was the baseline condition. So that means that the target-based cues and the arrow-based cue especially had quite a high number of errors. Whereas if we look to the more complex experiment, we can see that all 3 directional-based cues in arc, line, and arrow all had a semi-low amount of errors, whereas the target-based cues had a very similar amount of errors to the baseline condition. And the final bit of results here that I'd like to talk about is the pass scale. So the pass scale is a scale from 1 to 9, which the user can self-evaluate the mental effort they thought they used in the task, with 1 being the lowest amount of effort that they thought they'd used. So again, we can see that line is continuing to be very successful, with the baseline condition and all the other predictive cues being relatively even for the first experiment. But as the difficulty increased, we can see that in experiment 2, the baseline condition became very hard to understand the task at hand. So we have the results here. What do they mean? So let's relate them back to our hypothesis. So our first hypothesis was all predictive cues have a positive effect on performance. So we can see from experiment 1 in the single case cue that all predictive cues were faster with the exception of the arrow cue. We also note that the error rate was unfortunately higher for most of the predictive cues, but thankfully line was still produced a very low amount of errors. And we can also note that the mental effort was very similar throughout all of them, but again, line providing that is superior. Whereas for the more complex experiment, the all-case experiment 2, we note that all cues were faster than the baseline condition, and we can also note that the directional-based cues had a lot lower error rate than the baseline condition. However, the target-based cues had a very similar error rate to the baseline condition, and the reason for this, we believe, is because when you have 16 green annotations shown to you at once, and let's say one of them is blinking or one of them is a different color, you might be led to believe that that is the current task at hand, so you might want to push that button instead, whereas it is actually the upcoming task. So we believe that is the reason why the target-based cues had a high amount of errors for the all case. And regarding mental effort, all of the predictive cues had a much lower mental effort than the baseline condition for the complex task. So we can definitely see that having a predictive cue as the task complexity increases becomes a lot more important than having no guidance at all. And even in a simple case scenario, having a line predictive cues especially is very beneficial to the user. Now to our second hypothesis, we had directional-based cues lead to superior performance over target-based cues. Again, we note that the line predictive cue was superior among all factors, so that's great. However, the arrow predictive cue performed very similar or slightly worse than the target-based cues, excluding the error rate for the all-case experiment. So the reason why the arrow predictive cue in the all-case experiment had a very low amount of errors, whereas in the single-case experiment had a very high amount of errors, we believe here is because in a single-case experiment, let's say the next task is highlighted by the green circle, but we can see that there's an intercepting button in the way highlighted by the red circle. So as the arrow is just pointing in a general direction, the user might try and push the closest button to the arrow. So that's why there's a high amount of errors in the simple experiment. But for the more complex experiment, where all 16 annotations are shown and the tasks are numbered, the user would have enough time to react and thus cause a lot lower amount of errors. But overall, regarding if directional-based cues are better than target-based cues, we can definitely say that the line cue is, but the arrow cue and the arc cue, which perform very similar to the arrow cue, can definitely have a bit of improvement upon, especially for the more simple experiments. And then our final hypothesis that we will talk about is the task complexity impacting the user performance. So regarding the more complex experiment, we can note that all of the predictive cues had an overall longer completion time, as you would expect, as there's now a search-based element in the task. And we also note that the baseline condition was significantly worse. So again, having a predictive cue is a lot better than having no predictive cue under a complex scenario. And regarding the error rate, as we already talked about, that the directional-based cues had a lot lower of an error rate, but the target-based cues increased in error rate. And the mental effort stayed surprisingly relatively similar throughout the simple and complex experiments, but the baseline condition, as we saw, did increase a lot in mental difficulty. So we can see that as task difficulty increases, that the predictive cues will perform slightly different, but regardless, it is always beneficial to have a predictive cue in a complex scenario than having no predictive cue. So in conclusion, my research provided a set of predictive cues to try and benefit user performance and mental load, and we believe that this was successful compared to the baseline condition, especially for the line predictive cue we found was the best in this specific scenario. And we also want to try and look into how the arrow predictive cue and why it performs so badly, and we want to try and experiment with different forms of that. That's all for my talk. I'd like to thank the Australian Government Department of Education and Training and University of South Australia for allowing me to do my research, and thank you all for listening.
All right, very good. Thank you for the talk. Any questions? Yes, down here. Yep.
Hi.
Hey.
So you mentioned that when you used the color cues, probably participants were confused with the current and the next task.
Yep.
So which means that the information inside this color cues is much less than in line, because line shows both points, the current and the next one. So the obvious thing to try to compare these two methods is to provide different cues for the current and for the next, like different color for the current and different color for the next, and this will be the kind of fair comparison between these.
Yeah, that's definitely an idea. I believe what you're saying was trying to provide a cue at the current one and also the upcoming one with an arrow. Yeah, that's definitely an idea that we're thinking of and looking into as well for the upcoming experiments on this.
Okay, we have time for one more question while the next speaker prepares his talk.
Over there, second.
The line condition, so it performed the best, but I can imagine that a new user who's learning a new assembly procedure and also learning some new augmented reality system, they might be confused by the line because they might think the line connects to some object involved in the current step. So do you have thoughts on how you could gently introduce or explain this visual feedback to a new user?
Yeah, definitely. So as the line condition, obviously it's linking two objects together, they might become confused with what's the current one, what one is the next. So we could try and modify the line one so that maybe we had a little bit of an arrow towards the end, so we can say, oh, this one's going to lead into this one. For new users especially, I think it's mainly just based on trying to get a lot of training in, and hopefully they'll adapt to it and learn what one goes to what links from what task.